You want to talk about one of the most dramatic transformations in American history? Forget the Civil War for a moment. Forget the Revolution. I'm talking about what happened when President Thomas Jefferson took his quill pen in 1803 and signed the Louisiana Purchase. Now, think about this for a second. With one signature, Jefferson doubled the size of the United States. 800,000 square miles of... what exactly? Nobody knew. And I mean nobody. The maps just said, "Here be dragons," in slightly more polite 18th century language. Into this massive blank space on the map walked a very specific type of human being. Not your typical American settler, with his plow and his Bible and his dreams of farmland. No. These were men who looked at 800,000 square miles of unmapped wilderness and thought, "Perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for." They called them mountain men, but that name came later. In 1803, they were just restless. Men who heard about Lewis and Clark's expedition and didn't think, "What brave explorers." They thought, "What took them so long?" Take John Colter. Now, here's a guy who defines the term different breed of human. Colter was with Lewis and Clark, but when the expedition was heading back to civilization in 1806, two trappers asked him to turn around and go back into the wilderness. Just like that, the man had been gone for 2 years already, but the idea of returning to civilization, apparently that was the unappealing option. So, Colter turns around, and what does he discover? Only the place we now call Yellowstone. Geysers shooting boiling water 200 feet into the air. Hot springs that could cook a man alive. When he finally made it back to civilization and told people what he'd seen, they called it Colter's Hell. They thought he was lying. But here's the story that really gets me about John Colter. Picture this. It's 1808, and Colter is trapping with a partner named John Potts along the Jefferson River. Suddenly they're surrounded by 500 Blackfoot warriors. 500. Potts panics, grabs his rifle, kills one warrior, and gets turned into a human pincushion by about 50 arrows. Colter does something that either makes him the smartest man in the mountains or completely insane. He surrenders. The Blackfoot strip him naked and start debating how to kill him. Some want to use him for target practice. Others prefer the slow torture method. But their chief has a different idea. He asks Colter if he's a fast runner. Colter, thinking quickly, lies and says no, he's terrible at running. So the chief gives him a head start. 300 yards. Then 500 warriors are going to hunt him down like an animal. Now here's where this gets unbelievable. Colter runs, barefoot, naked, across rocky ground covered with prickly pear cactus, for 5 miles. In the middle of winter, blood streaming from his feet and nose. Most of the warriors fall behind, but one persistent brave stays close. Colter suddenly stops, spins around, and tackles the surprised warrior, takes his spear, kills him, then keeps running. He reaches the Madison River, dives under a pile of driftwood, and hides there while hundreds of Blackfoot search for him. For hours. When they finally give up, Colter swims downstream and starts walking. 200 miles. To the nearest trading post. Still naked. Living on roots and tree bark. When he finally stumbles into Fort Raymond 11 days later, his own friends don't recognize him. This is what the wilderness did to men. This is the kind of human being it created. But Colter wasn't alone out there. The man who built Fort Raymond was Manuel Lisa, and if Colter represents the mountain man as survivor, Lisa represents the mountain man as entrepreneur. Lisa was Spanish, technically, but more importantly, he was smart. He looked at the fur, trade, and saw what nobody else was seeing. See, for generations, fur trading had been controlled by native tribes. They did the trapping, they processed the pelts, they set the prices. White traders just sat in their posts and waited for native traders to show up. Lisa said, "What if we don't wait? What if we go to where the beavers are?" Revolutionary thinking, and it required creating an entirely new type of human being. Because here's the thing about beaver trapping that nobody talks about. It's not just dangerous because of grizzly bears and hostile tribes, though those will definitely kill you. It's dangerous because it requires skills that take years to master. You have to read water like a book, understand where beavers build dams based on stream flow and timber availability, know how to set traps in freezing water so cold your hands go numb in seconds. A single beaver pelt was worth $2 in St. Louis. That might not sound like much until you realize that $2 in 1810 could buy you a month's worth of supplies. But you had to know how to skin the beaver without damaging a single hair, how to stretch the pelt on willow hoops, how to cure it properly so it wouldn't rot during the long journey back to civilization. And you had to survive at 10,000 feet elevation through winters that killed unprepared men as efficiently as any bullet. Lisa's solution was to create a hybrid workforce. French voyageurs who knew river travel, Spanish traders who understood native negotiations, American adventurers hungry for profit, and men like Edward Rose, AGC, free black men who found more acceptance in the wilderness than they ever would in civilized society. These men didn't just work with native tribes. They married into them, adopted their clothing, their languages, their survival techniques. After months in the mountains, they became something unprecedented in American history. Not white, not native, but something new. The props. Psychological transformation was as dramatic as the physical one. Imagine spending 8 months completely alone except for the animals you're hunting. No human conversation, no letters from home. Just you, the mountains, and the absolute necessity of staying alive every single day. It creates a different kind of human consciousness. Men started talking to their horses like old friends. They developed almost supernatural abilities to read weather patterns, detecting storms days in advance by changes in animal behavior. They could track a single beaver across miles of stream by tiny disturbances in the water that would be invisible to anyone else. Jim Beckwourth, who was born into slavery but became a Crow war chief, wrote about this transformation. He said, "Civilized men brought to the mountains had to die psychologically before they could be reborn as mountain men. The rules that governed behavior in St. Louis or New York, completely useless when a grizzly bear is charging you or when Blackfoot warriors are tracking you through snow. These men created their own code. Your word was your bond because there were no courts to enforce contracts. You shared your last piece of jerky with a stranger because next winter you might be the one who needs help. You slept with one eye open, but you never, ever abandoned a wounded companion." The economics driving this transformation were brutal and simple. The fashion centres of London and Paris were demanding beaver felt hats, millions of them. The soft underfur of beavers, when processed correctly, created felt that was waterproof, durable, and fashionable. European beavers had been trapped nearly to extinction. North American beavers were the only source left. But North American beavers lived in places that made European wilderness look like a well-maintained park. The Rocky Mountains weren't just unexplored. They were actively hostile to human life. Grizzly bears that could take a man's head off with one swipe. Winters, so cold that spit froze before it hit the ground. Native tribes defending their territory with sophisticated military tactics and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The men who succeeded in this environment weren't just tough, they were adaptable in ways that challenge our understanding of human flexibility. Hugh Glass, who we'll meet in detail later, survived having his back torn open by a grizzly bear. Jedediah Smith crossed deserts that killed most of his men. Jim Bridger learned to navigate by stars through mountain ranges that had never been mapped. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these early mountain men was how quickly they formed alliances with native peoples. Not the patronizing friendship of government treaties, but real partnerships based on mutual respect and shared danger. Tom Fitzpatrick learned to track game by studying how crow hunters read signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth. Native women taught mountain men which plants could prevent scurvy and which could stop bleeding from arrow wounds. In return, mountain men brought firearms, metal tools, and knowledge of European trading networks. These relationships created a unique society that existed in the space between cultures. Children born to mountain men and native women grew up speaking multiple languages, equally comfortable in a crow lodge or a trading post. They became interpreters, guides, and cultural bridges in a way that formal diplomacy never achieved. By 1820, this hybrid society was flourishing throughout the Rocky Mountains. Trading posts like Fort Raymond became crossroads where French, Spanish, English, and dozens of native languages mixed together, where Methodist missionaries debated theology with former Catholic priests who'd abandoned their vows for native wives, where escaped slaves found acceptance based on their trapping skills rather than their skin color. It was a world that couldn't last. The very success of the fur trade was bringing more and more attention from the outside world. Government officials who wanted to impose taxes and regulations, military officers who saw the mountain men's native alliances as potential security threats, businessmen who wanted to industrialize and control what had been an intensely personal individual enterprise. But for one brief, shining moment in American history, the mountains created a space where men could reinvent themselves completely, where your past mattered less than your ability to survive the next winter, where freedom meant something more than just political independence. It meant the absolute right to risk everything on your own terms. The men who walked into that wilderness in the early 1800s weren't just seeking furs or fortune. They were seeking a fundamental transformation that civilization couldn't provide. And for 20 years, they found it. But the mountains were about to teach them that even the most skilled mountain men couldn't escape the basic laws of economics and ecology. What had begun as the ultimate expression of individual freedom was about to become a case study in how quickly boom turns to bust when you're harvesting a resource faster than it can reproduce itself. The Golden Age was coming, and with it, trials that would test these men in ways that made grizzly bears and Blackfoot warriors look like minor inconveniences. The 1820s. Now we're talking about the golden age of something that probably shouldn't have been possible in the first place. By this point, word had gotten back to civilization about what was happening in the mountains. Not the sanitized version you'd tell your mother, but the real story. Men were making fortunes. Men were dying horrible deaths, and somehow, impossibly, a few men were becoming legends. Hugh Glass. Let me tell you about Hugh Glass, because his story is going to make you question what human beings are actually capable of enduring. It's August 1823. Glass is with Andrew Henry's brigade near the Grand River in what's now South Dakota. He's scouting ahead when he practically steps on a grizzly bear sow with cubs. Now, here's something you need to understand about grizzly bears. A female with cubs isn't just dangerous. She's a 600-pound killing machine powered by pure maternal rage. This bear doesn't just attack Glass. She destroys him. Tears his scalp loose, breaks his ribs, rips open his back so deep you can see his ribs. Glass manages to kill her with his knife, but he's dying. No question about it. His companions, Jim Bridger and John Fitzgerald, volunteer to stay with him until he dies, then bury him properly. They wait. Glass is unconscious, barely breathing, his back wound crawling with maggots. After 5 days, Bridger and Fitzgerald figure he's got maybe hours left. So they take his rifle, his knife, his possibles bag, everything he'll need if he somehow survives, and they leave. Just leave him there to die. Except Hugh Glass doesn't die. He wakes up 6 days later, alone, with a festering wound you could fit your fist into, 200 miles from the nearest settlement. What does he do? He starts crawling. Think about this for a moment. Really think about it. You're barely conscious. You have no weapons, no food, no water. You're 200 miles from help through territory controlled by hostile tribes. What do? Hugh Glass ate his own broken leg, let maggots clean his infected wounds because he knew they'd eat the dead tissue, and started crawling toward Fort Kiowa, 200 miles. At maybe 2 miles a day on good days. He survived on rattlesnakes when he could catch them, berries when he found them. At one point, wolves had killed a buffalo calf, and Glass scared them off, then ate the carcass raw. When he finally reached the Cheyenne River, he built a raft from fallen logs. 6 weeks later, 6 weeks, Hugh Glass walked into Fort Kiowa. The men there thought they were seeing a ghost. When Glass told them his story, they didn't believe him, until he described exactly where he'd left the bear's carcass. Until he gave them details only someone who'd made that impossible journey could know. But here's the part that really gets me about Hugh Glass. When he finally tracked down Bridger and Fitzgerald, and this took him months, he didn't kill them. He forgave them. Said any man might have done the same thing under those circumstances. That's not just survival. That's a level of psychological resilience that challenges everything we think we know about human nature. But Glass wasn't unique in the mountains. He was just the most dramatic example of what this environment was creating. Jedediah Smith. Now here's a mountain man who combined the practical skills of someone like Glass with the systematic mind of a natural scientist. Smith led the first American expedition to California, crossing the Mojave Desert in August, when temperatures hit 120 degrees in the shade, except there wasn't any shade. Smith's men drank their own urine, buried themselves in sand during the day to avoid dying of heat stroke. When they ran out of water completely, Smith climbed the highest hill he could find and spotted a green line on the horizon that might indicate a river. Might. He led his men 15 miles on that possibility. They found the Mojave River with 3 men already dead, and the rest maybe hours from joining them. Smith wrote in his journal that night, "The Almighty has preserved us through trials that would have destroyed lesser men. Not arrogance, just a factual assessment from someone who'd just accomplished something that would make modern survival experts uncomfortable." And Smith kept going. He reached California, trapped successfully for months, then decided to return to the mountains by crossing the Sierra Nevada in late spring, when the snowpack was at its deepest. His men thought he'd lost his mind. Smith made that crossing with 2 companions, leaving the rest of his brigade in California. They climbed through snow so deep they had to take turns breaking trail. When they reached the summit, Smith looked down at the Great Basin and realized he was looking at geography that didn't exist on any map, territory that would challenge every assumption about what the American West actually looked like. Then there's Jim Bridger, 18 years old when he first went to the mountains. Couldn't read or write, but he had a mind that processed geographical information like some kind of human GPS system. Bridger discovered the Great Salt Lake by accident while trapping along the Bear River. When he tasted that water and found it salty, he thought he'd reached the Pacific Ocean. Bridger became the most reliable guide in the mountains not because he had maps, but because he could remember every stream, every pass, every landmark he'd ever seen. Men said Bridger could describe routes through country he'd traveled once, years earlier, with accuracy that professional surveyors envied. But navigation was just one skill these men had to master. They developed techniques for mountain survival that seem almost supernatural to modern people. They learned to read weather in cloud formations that wouldn't even register with most observers. Mare's tail clouds meant weather changes in 18 to 24 hours. Ring around the moon meant snow within 2 days. When ravens started flying in straight lines, instead of their usual chaotic patterns, a storm was maybe 6 hours away. They tracked game by signs that required detective-level observation skills. A spider web broken at a specific height meant a deer had passed through. Disturbed pine needles in a particular pattern indicated which direction elk were traveling and roughly how long ago. Scratch marks on aspen trees told them not just that bears were in the area, but what those bears had been eating and whether they were preparing for hibernation. Medical treatment in the mountains required improvisation that would horrify modern doctors, but somehow worked often enough to keep men alive. Arrow wounds were treated with gunpowder cauterization, i.e., literally burning the wound closed with black powder. It prevented infection and stopped bleeding, though the pain was apparently indescribable. Tom Fitzpatrick, he called him Broken Hand, after a rifle exploded in his grip, developed a technique for treating frostbite using a mixture of bear grease and specific herbs his Arapaho wife taught him. Men who should have lost fingers and toes to frostbite kept their digits because Fitzpatrick understood that gradual warming was less damaging than rapid reheating. The daily routine of a mountain man trapper was built around rhythms that had nothing to do with civilization's schedules. They woke before dawn because that's when beavers were most active, spent the coldest hours of early morning wading through streams that were literally freezing, checking trap lines that might extend for miles. The actual trapping required skills that took years to develop. You had to understand beaver behavior well enough to predict where they'd travel between their lodge and their food sources. Set traps in water deep enough that a caught beaver would drown quickly, but not so deep that you couldn't retrieve your trap if it got dragged away. Skinning a beaver properly was an art form. One wrong cut could damage the pelt enough to reduce its value by half. The hide had to be stretched on willow hoops with exactly the right tension. Too tight, and it would tear when it dried. Too loose, and it wouldn't cure properly. The whole process, from killing the beaver to having a market-ready pelt, took about 4 hours per animal. And then there was the isolation. Months and months of seeing no other human beings except maybe your partner, if you were lucky enough to have one. The psychological impact of this. The isolation created men who developed almost mystical relationships with the natural world. Bill Williams, who spent more time alone in the mountains than almost anyone, claimed he could sense the presence of hostile Indians from miles away. Just a feeling, he said, like the mountains themselves were warning him. Other mountain men reported similar experiences, sudden certainties about danger that proved accurate often enough to keep them alive. The spiritual transformation was as profound as the physical one. Men who'd been raised in Christian households started adopting native spiritual practices that made more sense in mountain environments. They began to see the landscape as alive, responsive, deserving of respect rather than conquest. Warren Ferris wrote about this in his journal. The mountains change a man's relationship with the divine. God feels closer here, but also more demanding. There's no room for pretense when your survival depends on reading his signs in cloud formations and animal behavior. This spiritual evolution created mountain men who were comfortable moving between worlds, white, trading posts and native villages, Christian prayer and tribal ceremonies, civilized conversation, and months of solitude that would drive most people insane. By 1825, these skills had created a subculture unlike anything in American history. Men who could survive in environments that killed the unprepared, navigate through unmapped territory, and function as cultural bridges between societies that had been in conflict for generations. But here's what's remarkable. They were just getting started. The golden age of the fur trade was about to explode into something even more extraordinary. Something that would bring hundreds of mountain men together every summer in gatherings that redefined what was possible when you removed all the normal constraints of civilized society. The rendezvous were coming, and with them, the wildest experiment in American capitalism that anyone had ever imagined. Picture this. It's July 1825, and you're standing in a valley near the Green River in what will someday be Wyoming. But right now, it's just wilderness, endless wilderness that stretches to every horizon. And suddenly, from that wilderness, men start emerging. Not just a few men, hundreds of them. Mountain men who haven't seen another white face in 11 months. Native trading parties bringing thousands of horses and buffalo robes. Mexican merchants who've traveled 1,000 miles from Santa Fe. And, this is where it gets really interesting, enterprising women who've made the same impossible journey because they know what happens when you get 600 men together who've been alone in the mountains for a year. Welcome to Rendezvous, the wildest gathering in human history. Now, the economics of Rendezvous were pure capitalism, at its most brutal and efficient. No government regulations, no consumer protections, just supply, demand, and whatever price the market would bear when men were desperate enough. A gallon of whiskey that cost 50 cents in Missouri, $30 at Rendezvous. A pound of coffee, worth 12 cents back in civilization, $3 in the mountains. Steel knives, blankets, ammunition, beads for trading with native wives, everything marked up by factors that would make modern retailers blush. But here's the thing, nobody complained, because a mountain man showing up at Rendezvous with a pack train of beaver pelts wasn't just rich. He was rich in a way that had no equivalent in civilized society. Those pelts represented pure profit from skills that couldn't be learned in any school, risks that most people couldn't imagine taking. William Sublette, one of the most successful mountain men entrepreneurs, once showed up at Rendezvous with pelts worth $15,000 in 1825 money. That's buying power equivalent to maybe $300,000 today. From 1 year of trapping. But money was just the beginning of what made Rendezvous extraordinary. These gatherings became testing grounds for skills that couldn't be demonstrated anywhere else in the world. Shooting contests where the best marksmen in North America competed for stakes that could make or break a man's entire year. William Sublette could drive nails at 50 yards with a rifle, not hit a target near the nail, drive the nail into the wood. Kit Carson, who barely weighed 130 pounds, could put 6 shots through a playing card at 40 paces, while other men were still reloading their first shot. The horse racing was even more spectacular. Contests between mountain men and native riders who'd grown up on horseback, with bets that sometimes included entire outfits, horses, traps, weapons, everything a man needed to survive another year in the mountains. But the real drama happened when cultures collided in ways that had never been possible before. French voyageurs teaching Americans their paddling songs around campfires, Nez Perce guides sharing knowledge about mountain passes that weren't on any map, Delaware Indians from the East Coast meeting Crow warriors from the northern plains and discovering they had more in common than either group had with the white men they were both trading with. And the negotiations. My God, the negotiations. Marriage arrangements between prominent trappers and daughters of important chiefs. Not romantic courtship, e.g. stay, strategic alliances that could determine whether a trapping brigade had safe passage through tribal territory or got wiped out in an ambush. These marriages weren't casual arrangements. They created kinship networks that spanned the continent. When Jim Beckwourth married into the Crow Nation, he wasn't just gaining a wife. He was gaining brothers, uncles, cousins, who would provide intelligence about enemy movements, safe havens during storms, and trading. Opportunities that could make the difference between profit and bankruptcy. The cultural exchange went deeper than business. Mountain men learned native techniques for surviving in specific environments that European knowledge couldn't address. How to find water in desert country. By watching bird flight patterns, which plants could prevent scurvy during long winters. How to read smoke signals that carried complex information across vast distances. In return, native peoples gained access to manufactured goods that revolutionized their daily lives. Steel knives that held edges far better than stone tools. Firearms that changed hunting strategies and military tactics. Blankets and metal cooking pots that made harsh winters more survivable. But Rendezvous had its dark side too. Men who'd spent a year risking their lives for profit sometimes lost everything in a week of drinking and gambling. Joe Meek once described watching a trapper lose $2,000 worth of pelts in a single card game, then walk into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and a rifle he'd borrowed. The violence was casual and brutal. Knife fights over gambling debts that left men permanently maimed. Fistfights between rivals that went on until one man literally couldn't continue. And always the underlying tension between different cultural groups who might be trading partners today and enemies tomorrow. The most famous fight in Rendezvous history involved Kit Carson and Joseph Chouinard, a French-Canadian trapper who'd been bullying smaller men all week. Carson barely came up to Chouinard's shoulder, but when Chouinard publicly insulted an Arapaho woman Carson was courting, Carson challenged him to what amounted to a duel, not with pistols, with knives, on horseback. They circled each other like medieval knights, slashing with butcher knives while their horses wheeled and spun. Carson took a cut across his shoulder that should have ended the fight, but he managed to get inside Chouinard's reach and put his knife through the bigger man's arm. Chouinard dropped his weapon and yielded. That fight established Carson's reputation throughout the mountains, not just as a skilled fighter, but as a man who wouldn't be intimidated regardless of the odds against him. The diseases were the worst part. Smallpox, cholera, influenza, IC, infections that mountain men might carry without symptoms, could devastate native communities that had no immunity. Entire villages would be wiped out in the weeks following Rendezvous, creating guilt and recrimination that poisoned relationships for years. But despite the violence and disease and exploitation, something remarkable was happening at these gatherings. For 2 weeks every summer, racial and cultural barriers that seemed insurmountable in the outside world simply disappeared. A black mountain man like Edward Rose could find himself negotiating as an equal with white traders and native chiefs. Social status depended on your skills and reputation, not your background. Jim Beckworth, born into slavery, became one of the most respected men in the mountains because he could track game, navigate by stars, and fight effectively when necessary. The languages that developed at Rendezvous were hybrids that hadn't existed before, combinations of English, French, Spanish, and dozens of native languages that created new ways of expressing ideas about survival, trading, and cooperation across cultural boundaries. Warren Ferris wrote about hearing a conversation between a Delaware Indian, a Mexican trader, and a French voyageur who were planning a joint trapping expedition. They switched between 4 languages in a single sentence, but somehow understood each other perfectly because they shared the common vocabulary of mountain survival. The trading itself became an art form, not just exchanging goods, but negotiating relationships that might last for years. A successful trade at Rendezvous wasn't just about getting fair value for your pelts. It was about establishing trust with suppliers who might save your life the following winter. Experienced mountain men spent weeks at Rendezvous, gathering intelligence that was more valuable than any manufactured goods. Which streams were trapped out, which tribal territories were safe to enter, which passes stayed open latest in the season. This information could mean the difference between a profitable year and a disaster. By 1830, Rendezvous had become legendary even in civilized society. Newspapers in New York and London published sensationalized accounts of these gatherings. Politicians debated whether the government should regulate or ban them entirely, but the men who participated understood something that outside observers missed. Rendezvous wasn't just a business meeting or a cultural festival. It was proof that human beings could create functional societies based on merit and mutual benefit, rather than rigid social hierarchies. For 2 weeks every summer, The mountains demonstrated an alternative to the way civilization organized itself. It wasn't perfect. The violence and exploitation were real problems, but it was functional in ways that impressed even critics who disapproved of the lifestyle. As the 1830s approached, rendezvous were attracting attention from forces that would ultimately destroy them: government officials who wanted to tax and regulate the trade, military leaders who saw the mountain men's native alliances as potential security threats, businessmen who wanted to industrialize and control what had been an intensely individual enterprise. But in 1829, those threats still seemed distant. The beaver populations were still strong. The demand for furs in European markets was still growing, and every summer the valleys of the Green River and Pierre's Hole filled with men who'd proven that freedom and profit could coexist, that cultural barriers were more flexible than anyone had imagined. The Golden Age was reaching its peak, but already forces were building that would challenge everything these men had created. International competition was intensifying. The beaver populations were beginning to show signs of stress, and somewhere in the fashion centers of London and Paris, styles were beginning to change in ways that would shake the fur trade to its foundations. The mountain men didn't know it yet, but they were about to face their greatest test. Not grizzly bears or hostile tribes or impossible weather, but the remorseless logic of international economics and ecological limits. By 1830, the fur trade had stopped being a romantic adventure. It had become war. Not the kind of war fought by armies with uniforms and flags. This was economic warfare fought by brigades of trappers representing competing empires, with native nations playing each side for advantage while defending territories their ancestors had controlled for thousands of years. The British Hudson's Bay Company controlled everything north of the Columbia River with military efficiency that would make modern corporations envious. Their trading posts were fortresses staffed by men who understood that fur trading was just another form of imperial expansion. Dr. John McLaughlin, the Hudson's Bay factor at Fort Vancouver, didn't just manage a trading operation. He governed a territory larger than most European countries, with absolute authority over British subjects and trading relationships with dozens of native tribes. McLaughlin's strategy was brutally simple: deny Americans access to the best trapping territories by any means necessary. If that meant arming friendly tribes and encouraging attacks on American brigades, so be it. If it meant trapping streams completely bare to eliminate future profits, that was acceptable too. The Americans responded with Peter Skane Ogden, a man who'd been kicked out of the Hudson's Bay Company for violence, but proved too valuable to stay expelled. Ogden led what amounted to military expeditions disguised as trapping brigades, 50 to 60 men armed like soldiers, moving through disputed territory with orders to establish American presence by force if necessary. Ogden's instructions were explicit: trap every stream bare before British brigades could reach them. Leave nothing for competitors. If that meant ecological devastation, well, beaver populations could recover later when the political situation stabilized. The Mexicans added another layer of complexity. California and New Mexico were technically closed to foreign trappers, but Mexican authorities were willing to license American expeditions under certain circumstances, usually circumstances that involved bribes, political connections, or agreements to kill Apaches. Ewing Young led several illegal expeditions into Mexican California, operating like a combination businessman and outlaw. His brigades would trap successfully for months, then cache their pelts in hidden locations while Mexican authorities searched in vain. Young once hid $50,000 worth of beaver pelts in caves near the Salton Sea, then spent 6 months evading Mexican patrols while negotiating bribes that would allow him to export his furs legally. When he finally reached Los Angeles, Young had enough political connections to become a legitimate trader, at least until the next changing government invalidated his agreements. But the real action was happening where these competing empires met in the field. The Battle of Pierre's Hole in 1832 epitomized how quickly trading expeditions could turn into military campaigns. William Sublet's American Brigade encountered a large party of Gros Ventre warriors near the rendezvous site. What started as a misunderstanding about trading rights escalated into a running battle that lasted 3 days. The Americans had superior rifles, but were outnumbered 5-1. The Gros Ventre had intimate knowledge of the terrain, but lacked the concentrated firepower needed to overwhelm fortified positions. The result was a stalemate that killed 30 men and wounded dozens more, with no clear victor. But Pierre's hold demonstrated something important about how the fur trade was evolving. These weren't random conflicts between individuals. They were strategic engagements between organized forces representing different economic and political interests. John Johnson's brigade fought a similar engagement against Arikaras along the Missouri River. Johnson had 40 men facing nearly 400 warriors, but his trappers had learned defensive tactics from their native allies and knew how to use terrain effectively. They held a fortified position for 3 days, inflicting casualties that eventually convinced the Arikaras to withdraw. But the cost was enormous. Half of Johnson's men were wounded, their horses were killed, and they lost most of their equipment. More importantly, Johnson's fight demonstrated that the old relationships between mountain men and native tribes were breaking down. The Arikaras weren't just defending their territory, they were responding to American encroachment with military tactics designed to drive out all white trappers permanently. The mountain men found themselves caught between competing pressures that were impossible to resolve through traditional frontier diplomacy. Strategic alliances shifted constantly based on immediate military and economic advantages. Jim Beckworth, the former slave who'd become a Crow war chief, led raids against Blackfoot villages while secretly maintaining trading relationships with American companies. Beckworth's position was especially complex because his Crow identity gave him legitimacy as a tribal leader, but his knowledge of white culture made him valuable as an intermediary. He could plan military campaigns using native tactics while understanding European concepts of territorial control and economic exploitation. The Mexican governor, Manuel Armijo, created one of the most bizarre arrangements of this period when he licensed American trappers to hunt Apache scalps at $100 each. This wasn't law enforcement, Armeja. It was genocide disguised as economic opportunity. Armijo's bounty system attracted the most violent elements of frontier society. Men like James Kirker and John Glanton organized expeditions that killed Apache men, women, and children indiscriminately, collecting scalps for payment while claiming to provide security for Mexican settlements. These scalp hunters operated with complete impunity as long as they were killing Apaches. But when they started taking Mexican scalps to meet their quotas, Apache and Mexican hair being difficult to distinguish, Armijo's policy collapsed in bloodshed and recrimination. The economic stakes driving these conflicts were enormous. Control of the best trapping territories could mean the difference between prosperity and bankruptcy for entire companies. A single successful season in undisturbed beaver country could generate profits equivalent to millions of modern dollars, but the ecological reality was becoming impossible to ignore. 40 million beavers had been reduced to a few 100,000 by 1835. Streams that had supported hundreds of beaver families were empty. Entire watersheds showed no sign of beaver activity. The mountain men were literally trapping themselves out of business, but competition prevented any individual company from practicing conservation. If Hudson's Bay Company left beavers alive in disputed territory, American trappers would kill them within months. If Americans showed restraint, British brigades would exploit their forbearance. This ecological destruction was accelerated by changing technologies that made trapping more efficient. Steel traps lasted longer and held more securely than wooden devices. Better, rifles allowed trappers to kill beavers from greater distances without disturbing entire colonies. Joseph Walker discovered Yosemite Valley in 1833 while searching for new beaver streams in California's Sierra Nevada. Walker's expedition was remarkable not just for its geographical discoveries, but for demonstrating how desperate the search for untapped resources had become. Walker led 60 men across the Sierra Nevada in winter, risking death from exposure to reach beaver populations that might not even exist. When they finally descended into Yosemite Valley, Walker's men were among the first white Americans to see that incredible landscape. But Walker wasn't there for sightseeing. He was there because every known beaver stream had been trapped bare, forcing expeditions into increasingly remote and dangerous territories. The international politics were getting more complicated as American westward expansion collided with British and Mexican territorial claims. The mountain men found themselves serving as unofficial agents of Manifest Destiny, establishing American presence in territories that would later be claimed through diplomatic negotiation or military conquest. Marcus Whitman's expedition to Oregon in 1836 included mountain men like Tom Fitzpatrick, who understood that their guiding services were supporting American territorial ambitions. Every successful crossing of the Continental Divide by American settlers strengthened claims to Oregon Territory. But the mountain men were also creating problems for official American policy. Their marriages into native tribes created kinship obligations that conflicted with government plans for Indian removal. Their trading relationships with British subjects violated international agreements. Their presence in Mexican territory provided justification for Spanish claims of American aggression. Kit Carson exemplified these contradictions. Carson's intimate knowledge of southwestern geography made him valuable to American military expeditions, but his marriage to an Arapaho woman and his friendships with Mexican traders created loyalties that conflicted with American nationalist interests. When war between Mexico and the United States became inevitable, Carson faced impossible choices. His skills as a scout and guide would be essential for American military success, but victory would mean the destruction of relationships and communities that had shaped his entire adult life. The fur trade was creating men who understood the American West better than any official explorers, but whose loyalties were too complex for simple patriotic categories. Tom Fitzpatrick negotiated treaties between the United States government and Plains tribes, using relationships built through decades of trading and intermarriage. But Fitzpatrick knew that these treaties were designed to facilitate American expansion at the expense of native sovereignty. Fitzpatrick's diplomatic success was based on trust built through personal relationships that treaty negotiations would ultimately betray. He was helping to create the legal framework for policies he privately opposed. By 1840, the fur trade had become unsustainable economically and ecologically. But it had also created a network of relationships and geographical knowledge that would prove essential for the next phase of American westward expansion. The mountain men had served as shock troops for Manifest Destiny without fully understanding the implications of their role. They had explored and mapped territories that would soon be incorporated into the United States through diplomatic and military means they had helped make possible. But their time was ending. The beaver populations were collapsing. Fashion trends in Europe were shifting away from fur hats, and a new type of American expansion was beginning: family settlement, agricultural development, industrial resource extraction. The skills that made mountain men valuable in the fur trade would soon be useful, mainly as support services for a very different kind of westward movement. The age of individual adventure was giving way to the age of organized colonization. The mountains were about to become very quiet indeed. 1838. That's when everything started falling apart. Not dramatically, like a military defeat or a natural disaster. More like watching a building collapse in slow motion. You can see what's happening, but you're powerless to stop it. The beaver populations had been declining for years, but suddenly the decline became catastrophic. Streams that had supported dozens of beaver families were empty. Dams that had lasted for generations crumbled and weren't rebuilt. Entire watersheds showed no sign of recent beaver activity. 40 million beavers reduced to maybe 200,000 in less than 20 years. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what happened in London and Paris when silk hats became fashionable. Picture this from a mountain man's perspective. You've spent the winter alone at 10,000 feet elevation, checking trap lines in water so cold it numbs your hands in seconds. You've survived on jerky and pine nut soup for months. You've outrun Blackfoot war parties and fixed broken traps with improvised tools. You show up at rendezvous with 200 prime beaver pelts worth $4,000, and nobody wants them. European hat makers had discovered that silk created hats that were lighter, more comfortable, and actually more durable than beaver felt. The fashion centers that had driven the entire fur trade for 30 years decided overnight that beaver hats were old-fashioned. The economic collapse was swift and merciless. Pelts that sold for $10 each in 1835 were worth $2 in 1840. Companies that had been profitable for decades went bankrupt in a single season. But the mountain men were facing more than economic collapse. They were facing the end of a way of life that had defined their entire adult identity. Men who had been masters of an impossibly demanding environment suddenly found their skills worthless. Worse than worthless, their expertise marked them as relics of a dying industry. Joe Meek, one of the most successful trappers of the Golden Age, faced a personal catastrophe that epitomized what was happening throughout the mountains. Meek returned to his winter camp in 1839 to find his Nez Perce wife and daughter dead from smallpox. Not just dead, they had been dead for weeks, their bodies preserved by winter cold in the cabin Meek had built for them. His wife had wrapped their daughter in her best blankets and laid beside her to die. Meek buried them in ground so frozen he had to build fires to soften the earth. Then he sat in that empty cabin for 3 days, trying to understand how everything he had built could disappear so completely. The diseases were devastating. Native communities that had been trading partners for decades. Smallpox, cholera, influenza, 44. Infections introduced through trading contacts were wiping out entire villages. The kinship networks that had made the fur trade possible were being destroyed by the very relationships that had created them. Chief Factor McLaughlin at Fort Vancouver wrote to his superiors, "The native populations are declining so rapidly that we may soon have no one left to trade with." Entire tribes that were powerful 5 years ago have been reduced to scattered families. The mountain men watched their native families and friends die, knowing that their own presence had introduced the diseases causing these deaths. The guilt was overwhelming for men who had spent years building genuine relationships across cultural boundaries. Bill Williams exemplified the psychological devastation this collapse created. Williams had been one of the most skilled mountain men of his generation, a man who could track game across bare rock, survive winter storms that killed other men, and navigate through territory that existed on no maps. But Williams couldn't adapt to a world where those skills were no longer valuable. He continued trapping long after it became economically pointless, pursuing beaver through increasingly remote and dangerous territory. In 1849, Williams was guiding a railroad survey expedition through the San Juan Mountains when he led the party into a winter storm that should have been avoidable. Williams, who had once been capable of reading weather patterns days in advance, seemed to have lost his survival instincts. The expedition barely survived. Williams died during the retreat, apparently from exposure that a younger version of himself would have prevented. But the real cause of death was psychological. Williams had become obsolete in his own mountains. The last official rendezvous in 1840 resembled a wake more than a celebration. Only about 60 mountain men attended, compared to hundreds in previous years. Credit was extended everywhere because nobody had cash, but there were no buyers for pelts regardless of price. Warren Ferris wrote about that final gathering. Men who once commanded respect throughout the mountains now wander the camps like ghosts, offering skills that nobody needs for products that nobody wants. The death of the fur trade has created living relics who are already legends in their own lifetimes. The career decisions facing mountain men were all variations of the same impossible choice: to adapt to civilization or die in the wilderness. Some, like Osborne Russell, made successful transitions. Russell had kept detailed journals throughout his trapping career, documenting not just geographical discoveries but philosophical observations about wilderness life that would later influence environmental thinkers like John Muir. Russell used his writing ability and geographical knowledge to establish himself as a guide for wagon trains heading to Oregon. His success was based on understanding that his mountain skills could be valuable in supporting a very different kind of westward expansion. But Russell paid a psychological price for his adaptation. His later writings show a man mourning the loss of something irreplaceable, a way of life that had allowed complete personal freedom in an environment that demanded everything a person could give. Others chose more violent adaptations. Liver-eating Johnson, whose Crow wife had been murdered by Sioux warriors, began a 20-year vendetta that became legendary throughout the West. Johnson killed Sioux warriors wherever he found them, allegedly eating their livers as revenge for his wife's death. Whether he actually practiced cannibalism is questionable, but Johnson's reputation created a psychological deterrent that protected other mountain men from Sioux attacks. Johnson's vendetta represented something deeper than personal revenge. It was rage against the collapse of a world where such relationships had been possible, where a white man could marry into a native tribe and find acceptance based on his skills rather than his race. The most successful adaptations involved men who could transform their mountain knowledge into services needed by the new kind of westward expansion that was beginning. Jim Bridger established his trading post along the Oregon Trail, providing supplies and repairs for wagon trains crossing the Continental Divide. Bridger's fort became essential infrastructure for family migration to Oregon and California. But Bridger watched this transformation with mixed feelings. He wrote to a friend, "Every day brings more wagons, more families, more evidence that the world I knew is ending. They ask me to guide them to places where they can build farms and towns. I help them, but I know I'm helping to destroy the last remnants of the free life I once lived." Kit Carson's transition was more dramatic. Carson became a scout for the United States Army, using his knowledge of southwestern geography to support military expeditions against the very tribes that had once sheltered him. Carson's military service was psychologically devastating. He understood better than most officers how to fight effectively against native peoples because he understood their tactics and their intimate knowledge of terrain. But his effectiveness came at the cost of relationships that had defined his identity for decades. The Mexican-American War of 1846 provided temporary employment for aging mountain men, but victory accelerated the transformation they had been resisting. American control over California and the Southwest meant the end of the legal ambiguity that had allowed mountain men to operate outside governmental authority. The California Gold Rush of 1849 created new economic opportunities, but also brought the kind of large-scale resource extraction that was completely alien to mountain man culture. The individual skills that had once been essential for survival became irrelevant in industrial mining operations. Some mountain men adapted successfully to gold prospecting, using their geographical knowledge to locate promising streams and their survival skills to work claims in remote locations. But mining required cooperation with legal and financial systems that mountain men had spent decades avoiding. The railroad surveys of the 1850s employed the last mountain men to map routes through passes they had discovered decades earlier. Their knowledge of grades, water sources, and seasonal weather patterns was essential for determining where rail lines could be built. But serving as railroad consultants meant participating in the final destruction of the wilderness that had created them. Every mile of track laid through mountain passes brought more settlers, more industrial development, more evidence that the frontier was ending. Tom Fitzpatrick's career epitomized both the success and the tragedy of mountain man adaptation. Fitzpatrick became the most effective Indian agent in American history. using relationships built through decades of trading and intermarriage to negotiate treaties with Plains tribes. Fitzpatrick's diplomatic success was remarkable. He prevented numerous wars, protected both native peoples and American settlers from unnecessary violence, and created legal frameworks that lasted for generations. But Fitzpatrick knew that his treaties were designed to facilitate American expansion at the expense of native sovereignty. Every successful negotiation brought reservations closer, traditional hunting grounds under American control, and the end of the way of life that had made his career possible. Fitzpatrick died in 1854, worn out by the psychological stress of serving two cultures whose interests were fundamentally incompatible. His funeral was attended by both American officials and native leaders who recognized that his death marked the end of an era when such bridge building had been possible. By 1860, the transformation was complete. The men who had once been the leading edge of American expansion had become curiosities, their skills valuable mainly as entertainment for people who couldn't imagine actually living the lives these men had survived. Buffalo Bill Cody began hiring former mountain men for his Wild West shows, paying them to perform sanitized versions of skills that had once meant the difference between life and death. Audiences gasped at demonstrations of marksmanship and horsemanship that represented pale shadows of abilities that had been routine in the mountains. The mountain men had become living exhibits in the museum of their own obsolescence, but their legacy was already being written in the geographical knowledge they had accumulated, the cultural bridges they had built, and the flowering proof they had provided that human beings could adapt to environments that seemed utterly hostile to survival. The silence in the mountains was deafening, but the echoes of what these men had accomplished would resonate through American culture for generations. The 1850s and 60s brought a cruel irony. The very men who had spent decades fleeing civilization's constraints found themselves begging civilization for employment. But here's what's remarkable. Their knowledge remained valuable, just in ways they never could have anticipated. The problem was that using this knowledge meant serving the very forces that were destroying the world they had created. Jim Bridger understood this contradiction better than most. Bridger's fort, established in 1843, became one of the most important way stations on the Oregon Trail. Every year, 10,000 emigrants passed through his post, their wagon wheels carving permanent scars across landscapes Bridger had once shared only with wildlife and native peoples. Bridger provided essential services, horseshoeing, wagon repairs, supplies, and most importantly, accurate information about what lay ahead. His geographical knowledge could mean the difference between successful passage and disaster for families risking everything on the journey west. But Bridger watched this transformation with horror and fascination. He wrote, "Every wagon train that passes through represents 50 people who will never understand what this country was like, when silence was the only sound you heard for months at a time. They see obstacles to overcome, not a world complete in itself." The emigrants needed Bridger's expertise, but they had no interest in understanding the life that had created that expertise. They wanted efficient service that would get them quickly through territory they viewed as empty wasteland to be crossed rather than wilderness to be experienced. Kit Carson faced even more direct contradictions when he became a scout for the United States Army. Carson's knowledge of southwestern geography, native military tactics, and survival in desert environments made him invaluable for military operations against the very tribes that had once accepted him as family. The Navajo Campaign of 1863 epitomized Carson's impossible position. Carson understood Navajo culture, spoke their language, and had personal relationships with many of their leaders. This knowledge made him devastatingly effective at predicting their movements and tactics. Carson led the military campaign that forced 8,000 Navajo people on the long walk to Bosque Redondo, Ardersier Row, a 300-mile forced march to internment on a reservation that couldn't support their traditional lifestyle. Carson's success came from understanding exactly how to destroy the foundation of Navajo life, He knew which Canyon de Chelly caves contained winter food supplies. He understood the seasonal movements that brought families together for ceremonies. He could predict where they would retreat when military pressure became unbearable. The long walk was militarily efficient but psychologically devastating for Carson. He was using intimate cultural knowledge to destroy communities that had taught him essential survival skills decades earlier. Carson's military reports from this period show a man torn between professional duty and personal guilt. He wrote, "I know these people better than any other officer in the army. That knowledge makes me more effective at defeating them. It also makes every victory feel like betrayal." Tom Fitzpatrick's transformation was even more complex. Fitzpatrick became the most successful Indian agent in American history, using relationships built through decades of mountain life to negotiate treaties with Plains tribes. Fitzpatrick's effectiveness came from genuine respect for native cultures and understanding of their political structures. Chiefs trusted him because his previous marriages into tribal families had created kinship obligations that superseded his official government role. But Fitzpatrick also understood that his treaties were designed to facilitate American territorial expansion at the expense of native sovereignty. Every successful negotiation meant smaller reservations, restricted hunting rights, and increased dependence on government support. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, negotiated largely through Fitzpatrick's influence, brought together representatives from dozens of Plains tribes for the largest diplomatic gathering in American history. 10,000 native people attended the negotiations, creating a temporary city on the Plains that demonstrated the political sophistication of tribal governments. Fitzpatrick orchestrated discussions between traditional enemies, balanced competing territorial claims, and created agreements that prevented war for nearly a decade. But Fitzpatrick knew that the treaty's ultimate purpose was to clear the way for railroad construction and increased emigration. He was helping to create legal frameworks for policies he privately opposed. Fitzpatrick wrote to his superiors, "These treaties will be honored only as long as they serve American interests. When that changes, the agreements I negotiate today will become justifications for taking whatever the government decides it needs." The Mexican-American War of 1846 provided temporary employment for aging mountain men, but victory accelerated changes they had been resisting. American control over California and the Southwest ended the legal ambiguity that had allowed mountain men to operate outside governmental authority. Stephen Kearny's march to California in 1846 employed mountain men as guides through territory they had explored decades earlier. Their knowledge of water sources, mountain passes, and seasonal weather patterns was essential for moving military equipment across desert and mountain terrain. But military success meant the imposition of American law over territories where mountain men had lived by their own codes. The informal justice, personal relationships, and cultural flexibility that had made their lifestyle possible became illegal under territorial governments that demanded compliance with federal regulations. The California Gold Rush of 1849 created new economic opportunities, but also brought industrial-scale resource extraction that was completely alien to mountain man culture. Some former trappers adapted successfully to gold prospecting. Their geographical knowledge helped them locate promising streams, and their survival skills allowed them to work claims in remote locations where other miners couldn't survive. James Marshall, who discovered gold at Sutter's Mill, had been a mountain man before becoming a millwright. His understanding of stream hydraulics, developed through years of beaver trapping, helped him recognize the geological conditions that indicated gold deposits. But gold mining required cooperation with legal and financial systems that mountain men had spent decades avoiding. Claims had to be registered with territorial authorities. Disputes were resolved through courts rather than personal negotiation. Success depended on capital investment rather than individual skills. The individual expertise that had once been essential for survival became irrelevant in industrial mining operations that could move millions of cubic yards of earth using hydraulic techniques. Hydraulic mining destroyed entire watersheds in months, obliterating landscapes that had taken centuries to develop. Mountain men who had learned to read subtle signs in disturbed vegetation watched streams disappear under millions of tons of mining debris. The railroad surveys of the 1850s provided the most ironic employment for former mountain men. Their intimate knowledge of grades, water, sources, and seasonal conditions was essential for determining where rail lines could be built through mountain terrain. John C. Fremont's expeditions employed mountain men like Tom Fitzpatrick and Kit Carson to map routes that would later carry the Transcontinental Railroad. Their detailed knowledge of elevation changes, stream crossings, and winter weather patterns determined where tracks could be laid successfully. But every mile of surveyed railroad route brought the final destruction of the wilderness that had created them. The Transcontinental Railroad would carry thousands of settlers, tons of industrial equipment, and the economic forces that would make frontier individualism obsolete. Warren Ferris, who had kept detailed journals throughout his trapping career, worked as a surveyor for the Northern Pacific Railroad in the 1860s. His geographical knowledge, accumulated through decades of wilderness travel, was essential for planning construction through unmapped territory. But Ferris understood that his surveying work was literally charting the path for forces that would eliminate the way of life he had once lived. He wrote, "Every stake I drive marks another mile of wilderness that will soon echo with train whistles instead of wolf howls." The most successful adaptations involved men who could transform their mountain knowledge into educational or entertainment services for people fascinated by frontier life, but unwilling to actually experience its hardships. Jim Beckwourth wrote one of the first autobiographies by a mountain man, carefully editing his experiences for audiences who wanted adventure stories without uncomfortable details about cultural complexity or personal violence. Beckwourth's narrative emphasized dramatic encounters with grizzly bears and hostile tribes, while downplaying the years of patient relationship building with native communities that had made his career possible. He knew that readers wanted excitement, not anthropological complexity. The book made Beckwourth famous, but required him to present a simplified version of experiences that had been far more nuanced than his popular audience could understand or accept. Buffalo Bill Cody began hiring authentic mountain men for his Wild West shows in the 1870s, paying former trappers to perform sanitized versions of skills that had once meant life or death. Colorado Charlie Utter, who had been a successful trapper and guide, spent his final years demonstrating marksmanship and horsemanship for audiences who gasped at abilities that represented pale shadows of skills that had been routine in the mountains. These performances preserved some knowledge of mountain man techniques, but in forms that emphasized entertainment rather than the deadly seriousness that had made such skills necessary. By 1870, the transformation was essentially complete. The men who had once been the leading edge of American expansion had become museum pieces, their expertise valuable mainly as curiosities for people who couldn't imagine actually living the lives these men had survived. The psychological cost of this transformation was enormous. Men who had defined themselves through absolute self-reliance found themselves dependent on institutions they had once rejected. Skills that had once commanded respect throughout the mountains became quaint demonstrations of obsolete techniques, but their knowledge was already being preserved in ways that would prove more durable than anyone anticipated. The journals they had kept, the geographical information they had accumulated, and the cultural bridges they had built would provide foundations for later developments in American society that none of them could have predicted. The silence in the mountains was profound, but something essential had been preserved in their legacy, proof that human beings could adapt to seemingly impossible environments, create functional societies across cultural boundaries, and maintain individual freedom even under the most demanding circumstances. The question was whether future generations would remember these lessons when they faced their own impossible challenges. By 1870, the last authentic mountain men existed mainly in Wild West shows and dime novels. But here's what's remarkable. Their influence on American character was just beginning. Think about this for a moment. These men had created something unprecedented in human history. They had proven that people could reinvent themselves completely, that racial and cultural barriers were more flexible than anyone had imagined, and that individual freedom was possible even in environments that demanded everything a person could give. That knowledge didn't disappear when the fur trade collapsed. It got absorbed into American mythology in ways that are still shaping our culture today. Buffalo Bill Cody understood this transformation better than most. When Cody began hiring authentic mountain men for his Wild West shows, he wasn't just creating entertainment. He was preserving knowledge of human capabilities that would otherwise have been lost forever. Colorado Charlie Utter spent his final years demonstrating marksmanship that had once been essential for survival. Audiences gasped when Utter put 6 shots through a playing card at 50 yards, but they were witnessing skills that represented centuries of accumulated expertise in reading wind, calculating distance, and maintaining steady nerves under pressure. These demonstrations preserved technical knowledge, but more importantly, they preserved the idea that such skills were possible, that human beings could develop capabilities that seemed superhuman to people living conventional lives. The journals kept by mountain men became invaluable historical documents precisely because their authors hadn't intended them for publication. These weren't sanitized adventure stories written for popular consumption. They were working documents created by men who needed accurate information to stay alive. Osborne Russell's journal entries about wilderness philosophy influenced early conservationists like John Muir. Russell had written, "The mountains teach lessons about human capability that cannot be learned in civilized society. Solitude creates clarity. Hardship reveals strength. Danger eliminates everything except what truly matters." Muir used Russell's observations to argue that wilderness preservation was essential for maintaining human characteristics that civilization tended to eliminate. The Sierra Club's founding principles drew directly on mountain man writings about the psychological benefits of extended wilderness experience. James Clyman's geographical notes guided scientists studying climate change patterns throughout the Rocky Mountains. Clyman had recorded precise observations about snow levels, stream flows, and vegetation changes over decades of wilderness travel. Modern climatologists use Clyman's data to establish baseline conditions for understanding how mountain ecosystems have changed since the 19th century. His detailed records of seasonal variations provide evidence about natural patterns that would otherwise be impossible to reconstruct. Warren Ferris's ethnographic observations of native peoples became essential sources for anthropologists studying Plains Indian cultures. Ferris had lived with Crow and Blackfoot peoples during critical transition periods, documenting social structures and ceremonial practices in extraordinary detail. Ferris's journals preserve cultural knowledge that was largely destroyed by reservation policies and forced assimilation programs. His descriptions of intertribal relationships, seasonal movements, and political structures provide information that tribal historians use today to reconstruct traditional ways of life. But the mountain man legacy went deeper than historical documentation. Their radical experiment in cultural hybridization challenged racial categories in ways that still resonate in American society. Jim Beckwourth's career demonstrated that social status could be based on merit rather than background. Born into slavery, Beckwourth became a respected war chief, successful entrepreneur, and published author through skills and relationships rather than inherited advantages. Beckwourth's success wasn't unique among mountain men. Edward Rose, liver-eating Johnson, and dozens of other men found acceptance in mountain society based on their abilities rather than their racial identity. This meritocratic approach to social organization influenced later American developments in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The idea that people could reinvent themselves completely, regardless of background, became central to American mythology about individual opportunity. The economic model developed by mountain men, extreme individualism, coupled with cooperative survival, became a template for American entrepreneurship that extends far beyond the fur trade. Venture capitalism, freelance consulting, and startup culture all reflect mountain man approaches to risk-taking, skill development, and economic opportunity. The willingness to risk everything for potential freedom remains a distinctive characteristic of American business culture. But the mountain men also demonstrated the importance of cooperative relationships for individual success. Their kinship networks with native tribes, their partnerships with men from different cultural backgrounds, and their informal support systems created models for business relationships based on trust rather than legal contracts. Modern networking and strategic alliances reflect mountain man, understanding that individual success requires collective cooperation, even in highly competitive environments. Theodore Roosevelt's conservation movement drew directly on mountain man writings about pristine wilderness and the psychological benefits of outdoor challenges. Roosevelt used mountain man narratives to argue that wilderness experience was essential for maintaining American character traits that urban industrial society tended to eliminate. Roosevelt's strenuous life philosophy reflected mountain man beliefs that physical challenges were necessary for developing psychological resilience. The national park system was designed partly to preserve opportunities for the kind of wilderness experience that had shaped mountain man character. The Rough Riders, Roosevelt's volunteer cavalry unit in the Spanish-American War, were recruited largely from Western territories where mountain man traditions remained strong. Roosevelt understood that men shaped by frontier experiences brought psychological advantages to military service. Modern survivalist movements study mountain man techniques for wilderness self-sufficiency with almost religious devotion. Survival schools teach beaver trapping, primitive navigation, and weather prediction methods developed by 18th century mountain men. This isn't just historical curiosity. Modern survivalists understand that mountain man knowledge represents centuries of accumulated expertise in adapting to extreme environments without technological support. Military Special Forces units study mountain man writings about small unit tactics, survival psychology, and operating in hostile territory without external support. The mountain man ability to function effectively for months without resupply or communication remains relevant for modern special operations. Native American rights movements use mountain man testimonies about tribal sovereignty and cultural sophistication to support legal claims and challenge stereotypes about Native intelligence and political organization. Mountain man journals document Native governments, legal systems, and diplomatic practices that contradict historical narratives about primitive peoples who needed European guidance for political development. Legal scholars studying federal Indian law use mountain man accounts of treaty negotiations to understand how tribal leaders understood agreements that were later violated by federal authorities. These testimonies provide evidence that treaty violations were deliberate policy choices rather than misunderstandings about Native intentions. The mountain man willingness to live by other cultures' rules while maintaining their own identity created models for multicultural cooperation that remain relevant in modern diverse societies. Their marriages into native tribes, their adoption of native survival techniques, and their ability to function as cultural intermediaries demonstrated that racial cooperation was possible even during periods of intense conflict. Modern immigration debates often reflect tensions between assimilation and cultural preservation that mountain men navigated successfully for decades. Their experience suggests that people can maintain distinct identities while participating effectively in shared economic and social systems. The mountain man legacy in American literature extends far beyond historical fiction. The archetypal American hero, EDTP, independent, self-reliant, comfortable with violence when necessary, but fundamentally decent, derives directly from mountain man narratives. Characters like the Lone Ranger, Superman's Clark Kent persona, and countless Western movie heroes reflect mountain man characteristics translated into popular entertainment. The idea that true heroes operate outside official authority while serving higher moral principles comes straight from mountain man culture. Even modern superheroes reflect mountain man influence. Batman's preparation for any contingency, Spider-Man's responsibility for protecting the innocent, and the X-Men's position as outsiders who defend a society that doesn't accept them all, echo Mountain Man. Themes about exceptional individuals who serve community interests, despite official rejection. The technological implications of Mountain Man knowledge are only beginning to be understood. Their techniques for reading environmental signs, predicting weather patterns, and navigating without instruments represent sophisticated applications of observational science that predated formal scientific methodology. Modern environmental monitoring systems use sensors to detect changes that mountain men learn to recognize through direct observation. Their ability to predict storms days in advance by reading cloud formations and animal behavior demonstrates understanding of atmospheric dynamics that meteorologists are still trying to replicate. GPS navigation systems provide geographical information that mountain men memorize through years of travel. But GPS failures in extreme environments reveal the value of mountain man techniques for navigation using natural landmarks and celestial observations. Climate change research increasingly recognizes the value of traditional ecological knowledge preserved in mountain man journals. Their observations about seasonal variations, species distributions, and ecosystem relationships provide baseline data that cannot be obtained from modern instrumentation alone. The psychological research potential in mountain man experiences remains largely unexplored. These men developed mental resilience techniques for surviving extreme isolation, constant danger, and repeated loss that could inform modern therapeutic approaches to trauma and stress management. Military psychologists study mountain man accounts of maintaining morale during extended periods without external support or communication. Their techniques for psychological survival in hostile environments remain relevant for modern personnel operating in extreme conditions. The mountain man, understanding that individual freedom requires personal responsibility for community welfare, challenges both libertarian and collectivist political philosophies. Their experience suggests that true independence comes through voluntary cooperation, rather than isolation or coercion. Modern political movements across the spectrum invoke mountain man imagery, but few understand the complex balance between individual rights and community obligations that made their society functional. The mountain man legacy raises fundamental questions about human adaptability that remain relevant as modern society faces environmental and social challenges that may require the kind of dramatic personal transformation these men achieved. Climate change, resource depletion, and social fragmentation may create conditions that require people to develop the adaptability, self-reliance, and cross-cultural cooperation skills that mountain men mastered. They're proof that human beings can reinvent themselves completely, function effectively across cultural boundaries, and maintain individual freedom under extreme constraints, provides hope that modern challenges can be overcome through human creativity and resilience. The silence in the mountains ended long ago, but the echoes of what these men accomplished, their demonstration that radical personal transformation is possible, that cultural barriers can be transcended, and that individual freedom and community welfare can be reconciled, continue to resonate through American culture in ways that may prove essential for our future survival. The mountain men discovered something about human potential that we're still trying to understand. They proved that when everything familiar disappears, when all the normal rules stop working, when survival depends entirely on your ability to adapt and learn and grow, human beings can become something greater than anyone thought possible. That knowledge is their true legacy. And in a rapidly changing world, it may be exactly what we need to remember.